It was shortly after 1:30 in the morning on June 24, 2021, and most residents of Champlain Towers South were sleeping peacefully in their oceanfront condominiums. The building stood quietly against the dark Atlantic sky in Surfside, Florida, a small affluent town just north of Miami Beach. The rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the shore had lulled residents to sleep as it had done every night for the past 40 years. Some elderly couples slept in bedrooms they had owned for decades, having purchased their units when the building first opened in 1981. Young families occupied other units, their children dreaming in rooms with ocean views. Visitors rented vacation condos, enjoying what they thought would be a peaceful beachfront getaway. Security cameras in the building's garage captured the first signs that something catastrophic was about to occur. At approximately 1:15 a.m., the cameras recorded what appeared to be white dust or debris beginning to fall from the ceiling in the underground parking structure. The concrete ceiling was cracking, releasing fragments that drifted down onto parked vehicles below. The degradation was subtle at first, easily mistaken for minor water damage or normal building aging, but the concrete continued to deteriorate, the cracks spreading and widening with each passing minute. Within minutes, larger chunks of concrete began falling, crashing onto car roofs with impacts heavy enough to set off car alarms. The structural failure was accelerating, moving from cosmetic surface damage to deep structural compromise. The building's infrastructure was reaching the point of total collapse, though the sleeping residents above had no warning that their lives were about to end. At 1:22 a.m., the security cameras captured a massive section of the parking garage ceiling collapsing entirely, falling in sheets of broken concrete that crushed vehicles beneath. The structural columns that had supported the building for 40 years were failing, unable to continue carrying the loads they had borne since 1981. The failure propagated upward through the structure at terrifying speed. What happened next unfolded in approximately 12 seconds, though those 12 seconds would be seared into the national consciousness and would raise fundamental questions about building safety, regulatory oversight, maintenance requirements, and the hidden structural decay that can turn residential buildings into death traps. The central and eastern portions of Champlain Towers South, a 12-story condominium building containing 136 units, collapsed straight down in a progressive failure that consumed 55 human lives and left families across the world searching desperately for answers about how a modern residential building in a major American city could simply fall down in the middle of the night. The collapse began with the failure of structural columns in the underground parking garage. These columns, which had been exposed to decades of saltwater intrusion, poor drainage, and deferred maintenance, could no longer support the enormous loads of the 12 stories above them. When the first column failed, the load it had been carrying redistributed to adjacent columns. Those columns, already weakened by the same deterioration that had destroyed the first column, could not handle the additional load. They failed within seconds. The failure cascaded across the garage as each collapsing column added its load to its neighbors, overwhelming them in turn. The mechanism was identical to dominoes falling, except instead of small tiles it was massive concrete columns designed to support millions of pounds, and instead of falling in a neat line the failure spread in multiple directions simultaneously, consuming the building's structural support system. When the parking garage columns failed, the first floor they had been supporting fell straight down, pancaking onto the garage floor. The impact of that falling mass destroyed whatever garage structure remained intact. More critically, the falling first floor pulled down the second floor, which pulled down the third floor, which pulled down the fourth floor, in a progressive collapse where each floor's fall added to the mass crashing down on the floors below. The building literally fell into itself, each story collapsing onto the one beneath it, compressing what had been 12 stories of living space into a pile of rubble barely 2 stories tall in some sections. The compression was so complete that spaces between floors that had been 8 or 9 feet tall were reduced to mere inches in parts of the debris pile, crushing everything and everyone that had occupied those spaces. The sound was described by survivors and witnesses as indescribable, unlike anything they had ever heard. Some compared it to an explosion, though there was no blast. Others described it as a roar or thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. The building did not fall to one side like a tree being cut down, it did not tip over. It collapsed straight down, the floors stacking on top of each other as the structural supports that had held them apart for 40 years simply ceased to exist. Residents in the western portion of the building, which remained standing, were awakened by a sound and sensation unlike anything in normal human experience. The entire building shook violently. The noise was overwhelming, deafening, terrifying. Many thought it was an earthquake, though Florida does not have earthquakes. Others thought a bomb had exploded, their minds struggling to find any explanation for the impossible thing that was happening. Survivors who had been sleeping in the western wing that remained standing described being jolted awake by violent shaking and a roar that sounded like the end of the world. They stumbled out of bed in the darkness, disoriented and terrified, not yet understanding what had happened. Some opened their apartment doors to find that half the hallway was simply gone, replaced by open air and a view of a massive pile of rubble where their neighbors' homes had been seconds earlier. They stood at the edge of what had become a sheer drop-off, staring in incomprehension at the destruction. The building had been sheared in half. The eastern and central sections had collapsed, the western section remained standing, but just barely, and everyone in it faced the terrifying question of whether the rest of the building was about to collapse beneath them as well. Those who had been sleeping in the collapsed section faced a far worse fate. Most died instantly, crushed by the enormous forces of the progressive collapse. Concrete slabs weighing hundreds of tons fell from heights of 12 stories, obliterating everything beneath them. The human body cannot survive being crushed between concrete floors falling at high velocity. Death was instantaneous for most, a small mercy in a tragedy devoid of mercy. But some survived the initial collapse, finding themselves trapped in void spaces created by the random geometry of how the debris had fallen and stacked. These survivors were buried alive beneath tons of rubble, in complete darkness, often grievously injured, unable to move, calling out for help that seemed impossibly far away. Their voices echoed through the debris pile, haunting rescuers who could hear them but could not reach them in time. The building had contained families sleeping peacefully. A mother and her daughter who had moved to Florida for a fresh start. An elderly couple who had lived in the building for 30 years. A family visiting from South America. A young woman who had recently purchased her dream condo. A man who had survived the Holocaust and had fled to America for safety. Parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, couples married for decades and young people just beginning their adult lives. 136 units had contained 155 people when the building collapsed. In 12 seconds, 55 of them were killed. The survivors who escaped from the western portion that remained standing were the lucky ones, though many would never feel lucky again. They had survived by the random chance of which unit they had chosen to sleep in that night. The first 911 calls came in at 1:22 a.m., seconds after the collapse. The callers struggled to describe what they were reporting. A building had fallen down, a condominium tower had collapsed. People were trapped. People were screaming. The dispatchers, trained to handle emergencies but not catastrophes on this scale, mobilized every available resource. Within minutes, fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars were racing towards Surfside from across Miami-Dade County. The first responders who arrived faced a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Where a 12-story residential building had stood, there was now a mountain of concrete, steel, furniture, vehicles, building materials, personal possessions and human remains. The pile glowed with small fires burning in the debris. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the emergency lights, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere. The sounds were worse than the sights. Survivors trapped in the rubble were calling out, screaming for help, crying for family members. Car alarms blared from crushed vehicles. Water poured from broken pipes, electrical systems sparked and crackled. And from deep within the pile came creaking and groaning sounds as the unstable debris continued to settle, threatening secondary collapses that could kill both trapped survivors and rescuers. The rescue operation that followed became one of the largest and most complex in American history. Hundreds of firefighters and rescue workers from across Florida converged on the site. Federal agencies including FEMA and the FBI deployed resources and personnel. International rescue teams arrived from Israel and Mexico, bringing specialized equipment and expertise in building collapse rescues. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. The debris pile was massively unstable, with slabs of concrete weighing many tons balanced precariously on bent steel reinforcement bars and compressed furniture. Rescuers working to reach trapped survivors risked being crushed themselves if the pile shifted. The summer heat and humidity made conditions even worse, with temperatures in the debris reaching levels that could kill anyone trapped without water. Time was the enemy. Survivors needed to be reached within hours, not days. The rescue teams worked with desperate urgency, using everything from heavy equipment to bare hands. Cranes carefully lifted massive concrete slabs. Cutting torches sliced through twisted steel. Specialized cameras were threaded through gaps in the debris to search for survivors. Listening devices were deployed to detect sounds of life deep in the pile. Search dogs trained to detect living people worked alongside their handlers, scrambling across dangerously unstable debris. The work proceeded with agonizing slowness because moving debris too quickly could trigger collapses that would kill trapped survivors and rescue workers. Every piece of rubble had to be assessed before removal to ensure it was not providing critical support, preventing another collapse. Structural engineers accompanied the rescue teams, constantly evaluating the stability of the pile and the remaining standing portion of the building. That standing western portion presented its own nightmare scenario. It remained occupied by residents who had survived the initial collapse but now found themselves living in a building that had partially collapsed and might collapse further at any moment. The decision of whether to evacuate that section or allow people to shelter in place was agonizing. Evacuation would be safer but would prevent residents from potentially helping rescuers locate survivors and would eliminate the small possibility that someone trapped near the standing section could be reached from inside. Sheltering in place meant keeping people in a building that structural engineers could not guarantee would remain standing. Initially, residents were allowed to remain, but as the hours passed and structural assessments grew more concerning, the decision was made to evacuate everyone from the standing section, eliminating any possibility of additional casualties if it collapsed. The first survivor pulled from the rubble was a teenage boy, Jonah Handler, extracted from the debris pile hours after the collapse. His rescue, broadcast live on television, provided a moment of hope that perhaps many more would be found alive. But as the hours stretched into days, that hope faded. The reality became clear that very few had survived in the collapsed sections. The forces involved in the progressive collapse were simply too massive for human bodies to withstand. The heat, the lack of water, the injuries, the impossibility of breathing in spaces filled with concrete dust, all meant that survival was a matter of extraordinary luck, depending entirely on whether someone happened to be in one of the very few void spaces that remained, and that space had adequate air circulation. As the rescue operation continued, a grim reality emerged. The work was increasingly becoming recovery rather than rescue. Bodies were being found, not survivors. The focus shifted to carefully excavating the debris to recover remains and return them to families. The operation expanded to include forensic teams who would identify victims from whatever fragments could be recovered. Some victims would be identified from intact bodies, others from partial remains, some from DNA extracted from biological material found in the rubble. The meticulous, horrifying work of accounting for 155 people who had been in the building when it collapsed. On July 4, 11 days after the collapse, the decision was made to demolish the remaining standing portion of the building. Structural engineers had determined it was too unstable to remain standing and posed risks to rescue workers and the surrounding area. Tropical Storm Elsa was approaching Florida, bringing high winds that could topple the compromised structure. Controlled demolition would bring it down safely and allow access to areas of the debris pile that had been inaccessible while the standing section remained. The demolition was executed successfully, bringing down the western wing without damaging surrounding buildings or injuring anyone. The debris was added to the pile that rescue workers continued to methodically search and clear. The final victim was recovered on July 26, 33 days after the collapse. The pile had been completely cleared, every piece of debris examined, every void space explored, every possible location for remains investigated. Of the 155 people who had been in the building when it collapsed, 98 had been killed. The death toll included entire families erased in seconds, elderly residents who had lived in the building for decades, visitors who had been vacationing in what they thought was a safe building. The youngest victims were children, including a 4-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy. The oldest was an 88-year-old grandmother. 98 individuals who had gone to sleep expecting to wake up to a normal day, who had plans and dreams and people who loved them. All dead because a building collapsed. The investigation into why Champlain Towers South collapsed revealed a cascade of failures spanning decades. The building had been constructed in 1981, built to the standards and codes of that era. But the location directly on the Atlantic Ocean in a subtropical environment subjected the structure to extraordinarily harsh conditions. Saltwater spray from the ocean carried salt-laden moisture that penetrated the concrete, reaching the steel reinforcement bars inside. Steel, when exposed to salt, corrodes. As it corrodes, it expands, and that expansion cracks the surrounding concrete, allowing more salt and moisture to penetrate deeper, accelerating the corrosion in a destructive cycle. This process, called reinforcement corrosion, is well understood by structural engineers and is a primary concern in coastal construction. A report commissioned by the Condominium Association in 2018, 3 years before the collapse, had identified extensive structural damage that required immediate repair. The report, prepared by engineer Frank Morabito, documented major structural damage to the concrete slabs beneath the pool deck and entrance drive. The report noted that the waterproofing beneath the pool deck had failed completely, allowing water to penetrate to the structural concrete below. The report described the damage as major and warned that failure to repair it soon would cause the extent of the damage to expand exponentially. The report estimated that comprehensive repairs would cost approximately $9 million, a sum that the Condominium Association, which was responsible for maintaining common areas, found difficult to stomach. The building's residents, through their elected condo board, had to approve spending that would require special assessments or loans. The debate over how to pay for the repairs dragged on for 3 years while the structural deterioration accelerated. The failed waterproofing mentioned in the 2018 report was not a new problem. Records showed that water intrusion issues had been noted as far back as the 1990s, less than 15 years after the building opened. Residents had complained about water leaking into the garage. Engineers had observed standing water on the pool deck. Inspections had noted rust stains on concrete, a clear indicator of corroding reinforcement. Each observation had been documented, but comprehensive repairs had been deferred, postponed, subjected to committee review, delayed pending funding, pushed to next year's budget. The mentality of deferred maintenance, common in condominium associations where residents are reluctant to approve expensive assessments, had transformed what could have been manageable repairs into catastrophic structural failure. The design of the building itself contributed to the vulnerability. The pool deck, an elevated concrete slab that extended from the building toward the beach, was designed with a relatively flat slope for drainage. This flat slope meant that water would pond rather than drain quickly. The original waterproofing membrane installed in 1981 was not adequate for the harsh marine environment. It failed relatively quickly, allowing water to penetrate and sit on the structural slab beneath the pool deck tiles. That structural slab was directly connected to the building's main support columns. When the pool deck slab began to fail from reinforcement corrosion, it pulled on the columns it was attached to, creating additional stress on structural elements already compromised by decades of salt exposure. The investigation also revealed that the building had been constructed with several design decisions that, while not necessarily code violations at the time, reduced the margin of safety. The reinforcement steel in some areas was at the minimum required by code, leaving no extra capacity to handle unforeseen loads or degradation. The concrete coverage over reinforcement was in some areas thinner than ideal, allowing corrosion to reach the steel more quickly. The foundation design, while adequate when the building was new, had not accounted for the possibility that ground conditions might change over 40 years. The building sat on reclaimed land that had originally been a wetland. The groundwater table fluctuated. The soil composition was not uniform. Over 4 decades, the foundation had settled unevenly, creating stresses in the structure that the original design had not anticipated. The proximate cause of the collapse, the final trigger that caused the failure to occur on June 24 rather than some other date, appears to have been the combination of deteriorated pool deck structure and failed support columns in the parking garage. When the pool deck slab, weakened by decades of water intrusion and reinforcement corrosion, finally failed completely, it pulled on the columns it was attached to. Those columns, already severely corroded and weakened, could not resist the additional forces. They failed, triggering the progressive collapse that consumed the entire central and eastern portions of the building. The sequence matches what the security cameras captured, showing garage ceiling failure propagating upward through the structure, but reducing the collapse to a technical failure of waterproofing and corroded reinforcement obscures the human failures that made the catastrophe possible. The building's condominium association had been warned 3 years earlier that major structural problems required immediate repair. They had been provided with a detailed engineering report that described the damage and explained the urgency. Instead of immediately beginning the repair work, they debated funding mechanisms, hired additional consultants to review the first consultant's findings, formed committees to study options, and allowed 3 years to pass while the concrete continued to deteriorate and the reinforcement continued to corrode. The mentality that expensive repairs could be delayed a bit longer, that the building had stood for 40 years and would surely stand for a few more, that $9 million was too much to spend in 1 year, proved fatal. The regulatory environment in Florida contributed to the disaster. Unlike some jurisdictions that require regular mandatory inspections of residential buildings with immediate enforcement of repair orders, Florida had relatively lax requirements for condominium maintenance. Buildings could deteriorate for decades without triggering mandatory intervention by authorities. The 2018 engineering report was commissioned voluntarily by the Condo Association, not required by law. There was no legal mechanism forcing them to act on its recommendations. The report sat on file while residents debated and delayed. The town of Surfside had building inspectors, but their role was primarily reviewing new construction and renovation permits, not conducting regular structural assessments of existing buildings. The building fell through gaps in a regulatory system that assumed building owners would voluntarily maintain their properties adequately. The aftermath of the Champlain Towers South collapse forced a reckoning with fundamental questions about building safety in America. How many other aging buildings were slowly deteriorating, their structural problems hidden behind fresh paint and renovated interiors? How many condominium associations were deferring maintenance because residents balked at the costs? How many engineering reports warning of serious structural problems were sitting in files while buildings continued to operate? The collapse demonstrated that residential buildings require continuous maintenance and that deferred maintenance can transform a safe structure into a death trap over time. The fact that a building was constructed properly and was safe when new does not guarantee it will remain safe 40 years later if maintenance is neglected. The psychological impact on the Surfside community and the broader South Florida area was profound. The collapse occurred in an affluent community where people assumed buildings were safe, codes were enforced, and catastrophic failures simply did not happen in modern America. The realization that a residential building could collapse in the middle of the night, killing dozens of sleeping people, shattered that sense of security. Residents of similar aging condominium buildings across Florida suddenly questioned whether their homes were safe. Condo associations that had been deferring maintenance suddenly found their residents demanding immediate structural inspections and emergency repairs regardless of cost. The market value of aging beachfront condominiums plummeted as buyers became unwilling to purchase units in buildings that might harbor hidden structural problems. The families of the victims formed a community bound by shared tragedy and shared determination to extract meaning from senseless deaths. They became advocates for building safety reforms, pushing for mandatory inspections, stricter enforcement of repair requirements, better funding mechanisms for condominium repairs, and criminal penalties for negligent failure to maintain buildings. Their advocacy led to new Florida legislation requiring regular structural inspections of aging buildings, establishing timelines for mandatory repairs, and creating enforcement mechanisms to ensure compliance. The reforms came too late for the 98 people who died at Champlain Towers South, but they might prevent future catastrophes in the thousands of aging condominium buildings across Florida. The lawsuits filed by victims and their families eventually resulted in settlements exceeding $1 billion. The condominium association's insurance provided some compensation. The building's original developers and designers were sued for alleged construction defects. The engineering firm that had warned about structural problems but had not insisted on immediate action faced questions about whether they had adequately communicated the urgency. The town of Surfside faced claims that its inspection and enforcement regime had been inadequate. The complex web of liability reflected the reality that the collapse resulted from multiple failures by multiple parties over 40 years rather than a single responsible party making one catastrophic decision. The site where Champlain Towers South stood was cleared of debris in the months following the collapse. The rubble was sorted with personal effects recovered and returned to families where possible. The concrete and steel was tested and analyzed as part of the ongoing investigation, then disposed of or recycled. The foundation was excavated and removed. The lot remained empty for years, too controversial to develop, too sacred to ignore. Eventually, the land was purchased with plans to create a memorial to honor the 98 victims and ensure their deaths were never forgotten. The collapse of Champlain Towers South stands as a watershed moment in American building safety, comparable to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that transformed workplace safety or the Coconut Grove nightclub fire that revolutionized fire codes. It demonstrated that building safety is not just about initial construction quality but about ongoing maintenance, that structures require care and investment throughout their lifespans, and that deferred maintenance is not just poor economic planning but a genuine threat to human life. The 98 people who died were killed not by a sudden unforeseeable disaster but by decades of incremental decisions to delay repairs, defer maintenance and prioritize short-term financial concerns over long-term structural integrity. The building had stood for 40 years, it had survived hurricanes including Hurricane Andrew in 1992. It had weathered countless storms and absorbed decades of salt spray and water intrusion. Each year it stood reinforced the impression that it would stand indefinitely, that whatever problems existed were manageable, that comprehensive repairs could be delayed one more year. But concrete does not collapse on a schedule. Reinforcement corrosion does not send calendar invitations. Structural failure occurs when the accumulated damage exceeds the structure's capacity to resist it, and that moment can arrive without warning after years of gradual deterioration that seemed manageable until suddenly it was catastrophic. The victims deserve to be remembered not as statistics but as individuals. The 4-year-old girl who died had her whole life ahead of her. The 88-year-old grandmother had survived nearly 9 decades only to be killed in her sleep by a collapsing building. The young woman who had just purchased her dream condo had been celebrating a new chapter in her life. The Holocaust survivor had escaped genocide only to die in a structural collapse. Each of the 98 had value, had people who loved them, had contributions they had made and would have made. Their deaths imposed obligations on the living to ensure that building safety is treated with the seriousness it demands, that maintenance is not optional, that warnings from engineers are heeded immediately, and that no one else dies because a building was allowed to deteriorate until it collapsed. The memorial park that will eventually occupy the site where Champlain Towers South stood will serve as a place for families to grieve and remember. But the real memorial is the transformed understanding of building maintenance requirements, the new inspection laws, the stricter enforcement of repair orders, and the collective determination that such a preventable disaster must never happen again. Every building inspection that identifies and repairs structural problems before they become catastrophic, every condo association that acts immediately on engineering warnings rather than deferring expensive repairs, every resident who understands that maintenance assessments are investments in safety rather than burdensome expenses, honors the memory of those 98 people who died because previous generations did not treat building safety with adequate seriousness. The collapse took 12 seconds. The suffering of families who lost loved ones will last lifetimes. The responsibility to ensure such preventable catastrophes never recur falls on everyone involved in building construction, maintenance, inspection, and regulation. The engineering profession must insist on adequate maintenance and must refuse to accept deferred repairs on critical structural systems. Building officials must enforce codes strictly and must have authority to mandate immediate repairs when structural problems are identified. Condominium associations must understand that they hold residents' lives in their hands and that deferring maintenance to avoid assessments can be measured in corpses. Residents must accept that living in aging buildings requires ongoing investment in maintenance and that the alternative to paying for repairs is risking catastrophic collapse. The site in Surfside where 98 people died stands as sacred ground, purchased with innocent lives, demanding that we do better, that we learn from tragedy, and that we never forget that buildings are not just concrete and steel and property values but structures that hold human lives, and that the responsibility for protecting those lives cannot be compromised, cannot be deferred, and cannot be sacrificed for any consideration of cost or convenience or delayed financial planning. Because the price of failure is measured in crushed bodies, shattered families, and national trauma that echoes across generations.